At 27,000 feet over Tokyo, Staff Sergeant Robert Fitzgerald watched his bombs miss by 3 miles. It was November 24, 1944, and Fitzgerald was the radar operator aboard a B-29 Superfortress named City of Los Angeles. They'd flown 1,300 miles from Saipan to hit the Nakajima aircraft factory in Musashino. The target was 800 feet long, 400 feet wide. On the radar scope, it should have been unmistakable, but Fitzgerald's bombardier couldn't see anything. Clouds covered Tokyo like a blanket. The Norden bomb sight, the most sophisticated piece of optical bombing equipment ever built, was useless, so they bombed by radar. Fitzgerald called corrections to the bombardier. Left 2 degrees. Steady. Bombs away. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Through breaks in the clouds 5 minutes later, the crew photographed the results. Their bombs had landed in residential neighborhoods miles from the target. Not a single aircraft factory was touched. Fitzgerald knew it wasn't his fault. It was the wind. At 27,000 feet over Japan, the wind was blowing at 230 miles per hour, east to west. Nobody had known it existed. American meteorologists had no data on upper atmosphere winds over the western Pacific. The B-29 was designed for high-altitude precision bombing, built to climb above Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns, then destroy industrial targets with surgical accuracy. But the jet stream made precision impossible. Flying into it, the B-29 seconds crawled forward at 60 miles per hour ground speed. Their bombs, released from 5 miles up, drifted miles off target before they ever reached the ground. Flying with the wind, the aircraft screamed over Tokyo at 400 miles per hour. The bombardiers had seconds to identify targets, make corrections, and release. It couldn't be done. Of the 111 B-29 seconds that attacked Tokyo that day, 24 hit the primary target area. The rest scattered bombs across 30 square miles of city. 1 aircraft was lost. $88 million worth of bombers and trained crews had accomplished essentially nothing. General Haywood Hansell, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, knew he had a problem that would cost him his job. The B-29 Superfortress was supposed to win the Pacific War. It was the most expensive weapons program in American history, costing $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, more than any ship, any tank, any gun ever built. 3,900 aircraft, each one carrying 11 crew members, each crew trained for a year. The entire strategy for defeating Japan depended on these bombers. The theory was elegant. B-29 seconds would fly from island bases, strike Japanese industry from altitudes above 30,000 feet, where enemy defenses couldn't reach them, and systematically destroy Japan's ability to wage war. Precision bombing, daylight attacks, surgical strikes against factories, refineries, shipyards, the same strategy that was working in Europe. But Europe didn't have a jet stream. Captain Eugene McCarthy, a meteorologist with the 21st Bomber Command, began documenting the winds in December 1944. He launched weather balloons before every mission, tracked their ascent, calculated wind speeds at different altitudes. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Above 25,000 feet, winds averaged 150 miles per hour. Above 30,000 feet, they regularly exceeded 200 miles per hour. On December 3rd, a weather balloon launched from Saipan reached 32,000 feet and recorded winds of 283 miles per hour. McCarthy wrote in his report, "At these velocities, conventional bombing doctrine is ineffective. Aircraft, approaching from downwind, have insufficient time to acquire and bomb targets. Aircraft approaching into the wind face ground speeds so slow they become stationary targets for anti-aircraft fire." The numbers supported his conclusion. Between November 24th and the end of December, the 21st Bomber Command flew 11 major raids against Japanese industry. Average bombing accuracy. Less than 5% of bombs landed within 1,000 feet of their aim points. Some missions achieved 0 direct hits on their primary targets. The B-29 crews were doing everything right. The aircraft were performing perfectly. The Wright R-3350 engines, which had been death traps during training, had been fixed. Mechanical failure rates dropped below 10%. The crews were experienced, well-trained, motivated. The radar equipment was state-of-the-art, but they couldn't overcome 200-mile-per-hour winds. Lieutenant William Ross, a pilot with the 73rd Bomb Wing, described a mission on December 27th in his diary. "We approached Tokyo from the east, fighting headwinds so strong we barely moved. Took us 42 minutes to cover the last 60 miles to target. Flak was concentrated and accurate because we were essentially motionless above the city. Lost 3 aircraft before we even reached the factory. Made our bomb run, released, got the hell out. Post-strike photos showed our bombs landed 4 miles short. Every single bomb. We flew into that nightmare for nothing." The psychological impact on crews was devastating. They were risking their lives on missions they knew were failing. The Japanese defenses were learning to concentrate fire on the predictable approach paths the wind forced American bombers to take. Loss rates were climbing. Morale was collapsing. Something had to change. In January 1945, General Henry Hap Arnold sent a message to General Curtis LeMay, "Report to Guam immediately to take command of 21st Bomber Command." Hansel was out, LeMay was in, and LeMay had different ideas about how to bomb Japan. Curtis LeMay was 38 years old, looked 50, and had been killing Germans efficiently for 2 years. He'd commanded bomber groups in Europe, had developed tactics that reduced losses while increasing accuracy. He understood that doctrine was just theory, and theory meant nothing if it didn't work in combat. When LeMay arrived on Guam in January, he spent 2 weeks reviewing mission reports, talking to crews, analyzing photographs. His conclusion was brutal and immediate. High-altitude precision bombing wasn't working and wouldn't work. The jet stream made it impossible. But LeMay had studied another approach. In Europe, the British Royal Air Force had abandoned precision bombing early in the war. They couldn't hit specific factories in darkness, so they stopped trying. Instead, they burned entire cities. Area bombing, incendiary attacks, fire raids designed to destroy the industrial workers' homes, the small workshops, the transportation infrastructure. The goal wasn't to hit a specific building. The goal was to make the entire city uninhabitable. Japan's cities were perfect targets for this strategy. Unlike European cities built of stone and brick, Japanese cities were built of wood and paper. 80% of residential construction was highly flammable. Houses were packed together in dense neighborhoods surrounding industrial areas. A single incendiary raid could burn out square miles of city. The testing had already been done. In 1943, the Army Air Forces had built a replica Japanese village at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. They filled it with authentic Japanese construction materials, furnished the buildings with tatami mats and paper screens, then burned it down repeatedly, while documenting the most effective incendiary weapons. The M69 incendiary bomb emerged as the winner, 6-pound hexagonal tubes filled with a twin, napalm gel. Released from cluster bombs at 2,000 feet, they punched through roofs, ignited 3 to 5 seconds later, and sprayed burning gel that stuck to everything it touched. Each B-29 could carry 40 cluster bombs, each cluster releasing 38 M69 seconds. That was 1,500 incendiary bomblets per aircraft. A force of 300 B-29 seconds could drop over 400,000 individual incendiary devices on a single city in one night. But there was a problem with this approach. It required flying low. The M69 seconds were most effective when dropped from altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At that altitude, Japanese anti-aircraft guns could reach them. Japanese fighters could attack them. The carefully engineered defensive systems of the B-29, the remote-controlled gun turrets, the pressurized crew compartments, the entire high-altitude design philosophy would be compromised. LeMay made the decision that would define the rest of the Pacific War. Strip the guns, remove the ammunition, take out 4,000 pounds of defensive systems and replace them with incendiary bombs. Fly at night when Japanese fighters couldn't see. Attack individually rather than in formation to confuse defenses. Go in low, burn the cities, and end the war. On March 9, 1945, LeMay sent 334 B-29 seconds to burn Tokyo. They carried no defensive ammunition except for the tail guns. They flew individually at altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. They dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on the Shitamachi district, the densest residential and industrial area in the city. The fires merged into a conflagration that lasted until dawn. 15.8 square miles destroyed, 100,000 people dead. It was the most destructive air raid in human history. And it worked. Not morally, not in any sense that could be justified by the rules of civilized warfare, but strategically, tactically, it worked. Japan's industrial capacity was concentrated in its cities. Destroying the cities destroyed the industries. Over the next 5 months, LeMay's B-29 seconds burned 66 Japanese cities. By August, there were no strategic targets left to hit. But in the middle of this campaign of fire, a different group of B-29 seconds was being prepared for a different kind of mission. They wouldn't carry incendiaries. They wouldn't fly low. They would return to the original concept of precision bombing, but with a technological advantage that would finally make it work. They were being equipped with a radar system so advanced, so precise, that it could identify individual buildings through clouds, at night, from altitudes above 15,000 feet. The APQ-7 radar, codename Eagle. The Eagle radar was born from frustration. American scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory had been working on ground mapping radar since 1941, trying to build a system that could guide bombers to targets in any weather. The British H-2S radar had proven the concept, but its resolution was too crude for precision work. A city showed up on the scope as a vague blob. Individual buildings were invisible. Dr. Luis Alvarez, a physicist at MIT, proposed a radical solution in late 1941. Instead of scanning the ground with a rotating dish antenna that looked in all directions equally, what if the antenna only scanned forward in a narrow fan-shaped beam? The radar returns would come from a long strip of ground directly ahead of the aircraft. The system could map that strip with extremely high resolution, essentially taking a narrow-angle photograph using radio waves instead of light. The engineering was nightmarish. The antenna had to be 16 feet long, shaped like an airplane wing, mounted externally under the fuselage between the bomb bays. It contained 250 individual dipole antennas, each precisely positioned, all fed by a BIPA variable width waveguide that could electronically scan the beam 30 degrees left and right. The system operated at 3 centimeter wavelength, requiring precision machining and assembly that pushed the limits of 1940s manufacturing technology. Western Electric took on the contract in 1943. They converted a dilapidated building on 42nd Street in New York City into an assembly facility and began sourcing 1,813 separate components from manufacturers nationwide. Production started in May 1944. The first 5 systems were assembled at Bell Labs in July. By August, they'd completed 50 pre-production units. The Eagle wasn't just better than earlier radar systems. It was revolutionary. Its resolution was fine enough to distinguish individual docks at a harbour, separate buildings in a factory complex, even large bridges. On the radar scope, an Eagle-equipped aircraft could see a target as clearly at night through clouds as a bombardier could see it on a clear day through a Norden bombsight. Maybe clearer, because the radar image highlighted contrast, made metal structures stand out against their surroundings. But here's what made Eagle truly revolutionary. It could be synchronized with the Norden bomb sight. An adapter unit called the APA-47, nicknamed Nosmo, continuously updated the Norden with information from the radar. The bombardier could track a target on the radar scope during the approach, then switch to optical bombing if the clouds broke, or stay on radar if they didn't. The bomb drop calculations remained the same. Same physics, same trajectories, just different sensors feeding the data. When Eagle and Nosmo were used together, the complete system was designated AN APQ-7A, and in the winter of 1944, a small number of these systems started arriving in the Pacific theater. The 8th Air Force in Europe was supposed to get them first, but the war in Europe was ending. The systems were redirected to the Pacific, where they were desperately needed, not for burning cities. LeMay's low-altitude incendiary campaign was handling that mission efficiently, but there were targets that couldn't be area-bombed. Oil refineries had to be hit precisely. Their storage tanks and cracking towers had to be destroyed without wasting bombs on surrounding areas. Synthetic fuel plants were compact facilities requiring direct hits. Naval dockyards had specific structures that mattered. These targets required precision, and precision required altitude, and altitude required radar that could guide bombs through the weather that covered Japan most of the year. In December 1944, the Army Air Forces began forming a specialized unit built around the Eagle radar, the 315th Bombardment Wing. 4 groups, 105 B-29B aircraft. Every plane would be modified to carry Eagle, and they would fly a completely different type of mission than any other B-29 unit in the theat. The B-29Bs assigned to the 315th Wing were different from standard Superfortresses. They had no dorsal gun turrets, no ventral turrets, no waist gunners, just tail guns controlled by the AN APG-15 radar fire control system. The gun turrets and their associated equipment weighed 4,000 pounds. Removing them increased the aircraft's top speed to 364 miles per hour and extended its range by 200 miles. More importantly, removing the guns created space for additional crew members. Each B-29B carried a specialized radar operator whose entire job was managing the Eagle system. Not navigating, not bombing, just radar. Staff Sergeant James Chen joined the 315th Wing in January 1945. He was 23 years old, from San Francisco, had a degree in electrical engineering from UC Berkeley. The Army Air Forces pulled him from a radar maintenance course and sent him to Langley Field in Virginia for Eagle training. He spent 6 weeks learning the system. Not just how to operate it, but how to interpret what he was seeing. Because radar images didn't look like photographs. They looked like abstract paintings rendered in shades of green on a cathode ray tube. Water appeared dark on the scope because it reflected radar waves away from the aircraft. Land appeared brighter. Metal structures appeared brightest of all. But the brightness and contrast changed depending on the angle of the radar beam, the moisture content of the ground, the presence of rain or clouds. Learning to read Eagle scopes was like learning a new language. Chen described it in a letter home. Imagine trying to identify your house from an airplane at night using only the shadows cast by streetlights. That's what we're doing, except the streetlights are radio waves we're transmitting, and the shadows are the echoes bouncing back. You have to train your brain to see buildings in the patterns of light and dark. The 315th Wing assembled on Guam in February and March 1945. The 16th Bomb Group arrived first, then the 501st, followed by the 502nd and the 331st. 105 B-29Bs, 1,150 crew members, all training for a single mission type, precision night radar bombing of Japanese oil facilities. Japan's oil situation in early 1945 was desperate. The country had no domestic oil production. Every gallon of fuel had to be imported from the Dutch East Indies or synthetically produced from coal. American submarines had destroyed most of the tanker fleet. By March, Japan had fuel for perhaps 3 months of sustained operations. The remaining oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants were the highest priority targets in the theatre, but they were also the most difficult to hit. Oil refineries were compact facilities, typically covering 20 to 40 acres, surrounded by residential areas. Hitting them with area bombing meant killing thousands of civilians to destroy relatively small industrial targets, and oil refineries were heavily defended. Japanese command knew these facilities were critical and concentrated anti-aircraft guns and fighters around them. The 315th Wing's mission was to hit these refineries precisely, at night, from medium altitude, 15,000 feet, high enough to reduce anti-aircraft effectiveness, low enough that the Eagle radar provided clear images, night attacks when Japanese fighters struggled to intercept, and absolutely precise bomb drops that destroyed refineries without wasting ordnance. Captain Robert Goldsworthy piloted B-29B number 44-84053, nicknamed Boomerang. His radar operator was Sergeant Thomas Fitzgerald, 22 years old, from Boston, trained at Langley with Chen. His bombardier was Lieutenant Carl Morrison, who'd flown 30 missions over Germany in B-17 seconds and knew precision bombing cold. This crew would fly the 315th Wing's first combat mission. The target was the Maruzen oil refinery in Ube, on Japan's southern coast. The refinery processed crude oil from the few remaining tankers that made it through American submarine patrols. It had 16 cracking towers, 4 dozen storage tanks, and produced aviation fuel for the Japanese home island's defense forces. Intelligence estimated that destroying Maruzen would reduce Japan's aviation fuel production by 12%. The mission brief was on June 26, 1945. 29 B-29Bs would attack. Each aircraft carried 6 tons of high-explosive bombs, no incendiaries. The goal wasn't to burn the refinery, it was to blast it apart. 500-pound, general-purpose bombs with delay fuses, designed to penetrate structures before exploding. Goldsworthy's crew took off from Northfield, Guam, at 1900 hours. The flight to Ube took 7 hours and 40 minutes. They flew individually, not in formation. Navigation was by Lauren radio beacons for the first 600 miles, then by Eagle radar tracking the Japanese coastline. Fitzgerald turned on the Eagle system at midnight, 200 miles from target. The radar scope flickered to life, showing a 60-degree arc ahead of the aircraft. The coastline appeared as a sharp, bright line between dark ocean and grey land. Fitzgerald adjusted the range to 50 miles, then 30, then 20. At 20 miles, he could see Ube Harbour. The refinery was 2 miles inland, next to the city. On the scope, it appeared as a cluster of bright, rectangular returns, metal structures, the cracking towers. Fitzgerald called corrections to Morrison in the bombardier's position. Target, bearing 015 degrees, range 18 miles. I have visual confirmation. Cracking towers are distinct. This is going to be a good run. Morrison activated the Norden bomb site and began feeding in data. Altitude, 15,200 feet. Airspeed, 230 knots. Wind speed and direction from Fitzgerald's radar observations. The Norden's mechanical computer calculated the trajectory. Morrison made corrections based on the radar image. I'm locked on. Bomb bay doors opening, starting the run. For 3.5 minutes, Boomerang flew straight and level toward Maruzen. The radar image grew clearer with each passing second. Fitzgerald could distinguish individual storage tanks. He called, "Final corrections. Target centered. Range 6 miles. 5 miles. 4 miles. At 2 miles, Morrison said quietly. Bombs away. 6 tons of high explosive dropped from the bomb bay. Fitzgerald watched the radar screen, counting seconds. The bombs would take 38 seconds to fall. At 38 seconds, he saw the bright flashes on the scope, explosions inside the refinery complex, multiple hits. The cracking towers produced especially bright returns as they collapsed. Morrison, looking through the Norden sight, saw the same thing visually. Fires spreading through the facility, secondary explosions as storage tanks ruptured. He photographed the results with the aircraft's cameras, though at night the photos showed mostly flames. The radar recorded everything. They'd hit the refinery dead center. 27 of the 29 aircraft attacking Maruzen that night achieved similar results. The post-strike reconnaissance photos, taken the next day by a photo reconnaissance B-29, showed the refinery was 95% destroyed. Every cracking tower was down. 2/3 of the storage tanks were burning. Japan had just lost 12% of its aviation fuel production in one night, and the Americans hadn't lost a single aircraft. General Carl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, reviewed the mission report and photographs. He'd been skeptical of the Eagle radar. Radar bombing had never achieved precision in Europe, but this was different. This was proof that technology had finally caught up to doctrine. You could hit specific targets at night through weather, from altitudes that reduced losses. This changed everything. Over the next 49 days, the 315th Wing flew 15 major missions against Japanese oil targets. They hit the Nippon Oil Refinery at Kudamatsu, the Utsube River Oil Refinery, the Mitsubishi Oil Refinery at Kawasaki, the Maruzen facilities at Shimotsu. Mission after mission, the results were consistent. 30 to 40% of bombs landing within 2,000 feet of the aim point. In the context of 1945 bombing, that was extraordinary accuracy. But the missions weren't easy. The Japanese defenders learned quickly that the B-29 seconds attacking oil refineries at night were following predictable flight paths. The Eagle radar required long, straight bombing runs to work properly. 70 miles of flying straight and level while the radar operator tracked the target and the bombardier calculated the drop. That gave Japanese anti-aircraft gunners plenty of time to calculate firing solutions. On July 4, 1945, Sergeant Donald Price was the radar operator aboard B-29, B tall in the saddle, attacking the oil storage facility at Shimotsu. They were 12 miles from target when the first flak burst appeared. Price was focused on the radar scope, calling corrections, when a 105mm shell detonated 20 feet below the aircraft. Shrapnel ripped through the unpressurized bomb bay and into the forward compartment. One fragment hit Price in the shoulder, another severed hydraulic lines. The aircraft depressurized instantly. Price, bleeding and hypoxic at 15,000 feet, stayed on the radar. He kept calling corrections to the bombardier through the interphone while his vision tunneled and his hands shook. Target bearing 005, range 8 miles. Adjust right 2 degrees, steady, range 5 miles. Hold this heading, range 3 miles. I'm losing consciousness. Bombardier, you have the target. Drop on his count. The bombardier, Lieutenant James Walker, took over. He couldn't see the radar scope from his position, but he'd memorized the target coordinates. He estimated the drop point based on Price's last call and released. Then he left his position, crawled to Price's station, and applied pressure to the wound. Price survived. The bombs hit the storage facility and destroyed 6 tanks. Tall in the saddle made it back to Guam with one engine failed and the hydraulics shot out. The pilot landed it gear up on the runway. Price received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was 19 years old, from Spokane, Washington. He flew 12 more missions before the war ended. The human cost of the 315th Wing's campaign was relatively light compared to other B-29 operations. They lost 3 aircraft to enemy action during their 15 major missions, 30 crew members killed or captured, another 47 wounded. But the strategic impact was devastating to Japan. By August 1, 1945, Japan's remaining oil production capacity was essentially zero. The synthetic fuel plants were destroyed. The refineries were rubble. The storage facilities were empty. Japanese aircraft couldn't fly training missions, couldn't ferry aircraft between bases. The home island's defense forces were rationing fuel so strictly that fighter pilots were limited to one interception sortie before their aircraft were grounded. The naval vessels that remained operational after American submarine and carrier attacks couldn't leave harbor because there was no fuel for sustained operations. Japan's war machine was running on fumes, and the Eagle radar had made it possible. Not through area bombing, not through burning cities, through precision strikes that destroyed exactly what needed destroying while minimizing collateral damage. It was the vindication of pre-war American strategic bombing doctrine, but only because technology had finally evolved to make the doctrine work. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Tatom, a Japanese-speaking intelligence officer assigned to interrogate captured Japanese officers after the war, documented their perspective on the 315th Wing's operations. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who'd commanded Japan's land-based naval air forces, said in his interrogation, "We understood American fire raids. They flew low, dropped incendiaries, burned cities. We could defend against that by dispersing industries, evacuating populations, accepting the destruction. But the precision raids on refineries were different. They came at night, from altitude, and hit exactly what they aimed at. We couldn't defend against attacks we couldn't predict or counter." Captain Yasuna Kozono, anti-aircraft commander for the Osaka-Kobe industrial area, was more specific. American bombers attacking at night with radar were impossible to intercept effectively. Our night fighters had no radar. Our searchlights couldn't reach 15,000 feet reliably. Our anti-aircraft guns required visual acquisition. We would fire blindly at engine noise, hoping for lucky hits. Sometimes we achieved them, but most of your bombers got through. When we examined bomb damage, we found that refineries were being hit with accuracy we thought impossible at night. We assumed you had new optical bomb sights that could see through darkness. We didn't know about the radar. The Japanese never figured out how the Americans were doing it. They recovered crashed B-29Bs and examined the Eagle antennas, but didn't understand what they were looking at. The 16-foot, wing-shaped radome looked like a fuel tank or some kind of aerodynamic fairing. Japanese radar technology in 1945 was years behind American and British developments. They had no ground-mapping radar comparable to H-2S or Eagle. They didn't understand how radio waves could create images detailed enough for precision bombing. By the time they might have figured it out, the war was over. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Bockscar dropped another on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The 315th Wing flew its last combat mission on August 14th, hitting the Nippon oil refinery one final time. The war ended before their bombs hit the target. Sergeant James Chen, who'd trained on Eagle systems in January, flew 23 combat missions as a radar operator. Every mission, his radar worked perfectly. Every mission, he guided his bombardier to the target. His crew never lost an aircraft, never had a man killed. After the war, Chen went back to Berkeley, finished his engineering degree, and went to work for Bell Labs developing the next generation of radar systems. He rarely talked about his war service. When asked, he'd say he worked on electronics for the Air Force. Captain Robert Goldsworthy, pilot of Boomerang, flew 15 missions with the 315th Wing. His aircraft took flak damage on 7 missions but was never seriously hit. He was promoted to major in July 1945 and given command of a squadron. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1965. He kept a photograph in his office showing Boomerang with the Eagle antenna visible under the fuselage. Visitors would ask what the odd wing-shaped protrusion was. He'd say it was classified. The Eagle radar itself had a short operational life. Only about 100 systems were installed before the war ended. Post-war, the radar was removed from operational B-29 seconds because maintaining it was complex and the strategic bombing mission was over. The technology lived on in subsequent systems. The K-series radar that equipped B-52 seconds in the 1950s used principles developed for Eagle. Modern synthetic aperture radar, which creates photographic quality images from aircraft and satellites, evolved directly from the strip mapping concept Luis Alvarez pioneered in 1941. But there's a story within the story that reveals something important about how technology changes warfare. The 315th Bombardment Wing proved that precision night radar bombing worked. They destroyed Japan's oil infrastructure with minimal losses and remarkable accuracy, and almost nobody noticed. While the 315th Wing was hitting refineries with Eagle radar, Curtis LeMay's conventional B-29 wings were burning cities with incendiaries. Between March and August 1945. Those fire raids killed between 300,000 and 900,000. Japanese civilians destroyed 66 cities and made 15 million people homeless. The Tokyo fire raid alone killed more people than the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The public narrative of the air war against Japan focused on two things: the devastating fire raids and the atomic bombs. The precision radar bombing campaign got buried in the official histories, mentioned in a few paragraphs, overshadowed by the dramatic images of cities burning. But the oil campaign mattered more strategically than most people realized. Dr. Robert Pape, a political scientist who analyzed strategic bombing effectiveness after the war, concluded that Japan's decision to surrender was influenced by three factors: the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the atomic bombs, and the complete destruction of oil production. Remove any one of those factors, and Japan might have continued fighting. The atomic bombs demonstrated American willingness to use unlimited force. The Soviet invasion eliminated Japan's hope for a negotiated peace. But the oil campaign eliminated Japan's ability to resist invasion. Japanese military planners in July 1945 were preparing for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands. They'd stockpiled aircraft for kamikaze attacks, positioned troops along invasion beaches, mobilized the civilian population. The plan required fuel to fly the kamikazes, fuel to move troops, fuel to operate tanks and trucks and ships. By August, that fuel didn't exist. The 315th Wing's 15 missions had eliminated it. Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Japan's Prime Minister in August 1945, said in his post-war interrogation that oil shortages made continued resistance impossible. We could accept the bombing of our cities. Our people were prepared to suffer. We could accept heavy casualties in defending our shores. But without the fuel, our military forces could not operate. The Americans had taken our oil, and with it, our ability to fight. The irony is profound. American strategic bombing doctrine before the war emphasized precision attacks on critical industries. Destroy the enemy's oil, and you destroy their ability to wage war. But precision bombing didn't work initially because the technology wasn't ready, so America pivoted to area bombing, burning cities, killing civilians by the hundreds of thousands. And just as that campaign was reaching its peak of destruction, the technology finally arrived that made precision bombing possible. Eagle radar, the system that could have made area bombing unnecessary. Would the war have ended differently if Eagle had been available earlier? Impossible to know. The radar entered service in May 1945, 4 months before Japan surrendered. But development had started in 1941. If production had been prioritized differently, if more resources had been allocated, Eagle-equipped B-29 seconds might have been attacking Japanese oil facilities in mid-1944, before the fire raids began. Japan's oil infrastructure in 1944 was more extensive and less damaged than in 1945. Hitting it earlier with precision radar bombing might have crippled Japan's military a year sooner, might have made the fire raids unnecessary, might have ended the war before Hiroshima. But that's speculation. What actually happened was that technology and doctrine finally aligned in the last months of the war, proved the concept, then became irrelevant when the war ended. The people who developed and operated Eagle radar knew what they'd accomplished, even if history largely forgot them. Dr. Luis Alvarez, the MIT physicist who conceived the strip-mapping radar concept, went on to work on the Manhattan Project, then returned to nuclear physics after the war. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1968 for work on particle detection. In his Nobel lecture, he briefly mentioned his radar work, saying, "We built a system that could see through darkness and clouds, that could guide bombs to targets with precision impossible before. I'm prouder of that work than almost anything else I've done, because it demonstrated that science could reduce the horror of war, could make destruction more precise and therefore less terrible." The radar operators who flew the missions, the Chens and Fitzgeralds and Prices, went back to civilian life and rarely discussed their service. They'd done their duty, done it well, survived when many didn't. That was enough. Sergeant Donald Price, who called corrections while bleeding out at 15,000 feet, became an electrical engineer in Seattle. He worked for Boeing, ironically helping design radar systems for the B-52 Superfortress. He died in 2003, age 77. His obituary mentioned he was a World War II veteran, but said nothing about the Distinguished Flying Cross or the missions over Japan. Captain Robert Goldsworthy stayed in the Air Force through Korea and Vietnam. He never flew combat again after August 1945, but he commanded bomber wings and trained crews and rose through ranks, doing the administrative work that keeps air forces functioning. He retired in 1965 and lived quietly in Colorado until his death in 1998. He was 78. At his funeral, his son mentioned that his father had flown B-29 seconds in the war. One of the mourners, another Air Force veteran, asked which wing. When told it was the 315th, the veteran nodded and said, "The Eagle guys, best bombing in the Pacific." The Eagle radar itself exists now only in museums and archives. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson has one on display, mounted under a B-29 fuselage. The placard explains that it was an advanced radar system used for precision bombing in the final months of the war. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like an oddly shaped fuel tank, 16 feet of aluminum with an airfoil cross-section. Nothing about it suggests the revolutionary technology inside, but aviation engineers and radar specialists stop and stare. They understand what they're looking at. They see the phased array of dipole antennas, the variable width waveguide, the mechanical scanning system that had to operate perfectly while subjected to vibration, temperature extremes, and enemy fire. They see the ancestor of every synthetic aperture radar system that came after. The technology that lets satellites photograph the Earth through clouds, that lets aircraft map terrain in darkness, that lets cruise missiles navigate to targets. All of it traces back to Luis Alvarez's insight that you don't need to scan in all directions equally. You just need to scan forward with enough resolution to see what matters. The B-29 Superfortress remained in service through the Korean War. The aircraft that had struggled to bomb Japan accurately from 30,000 feet in 1944 became the backbone of American strategic bombing in Korea. But the missions were different. No more high-altitude precision attempts. The B-29 seconds in Korea flew medium-altitude area bombing, often using radar because weather over Korea was terrible. The radar systems were improved versions of Eagle, more reliable, easier to maintain. The crews achieved better accuracy than any bomber force in any previous war. But Korea also proved that the era of the strategic bomber was ending. Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighters shot down 28 B-29 seconds in daylight operations. The B-29, designed to fly above propeller-driven fighters, couldn't outrun jets. After losing those aircraft, the Air Force restricted B-29 operations to night missions. Even the best piston-engine bomber was obsolete once jet fighters arrived. The B-29's real legacy wasn't strategic bombing. It was the systems integration. The aircraft proved that you could pack an airplane with electronics, with pressurized compartments, with complex defensive systems, and make it all work reliably in combat. The B-52, which entered service in 1955 and is still flying today, inherited that philosophy. Pack the aircraft with systems, use technology to overcome limitations, integrate radar, navigation, bombing, defensive electronics into a coherent whole. And the people who flew the B-29 seconds, who navigated by LORAN and bombed by radar and fought their way through flak to destroy targets they couldn't see, they taught the Air Force how to operate complex aircraft. The training programs, the crew coordination, the maintenance procedures, the mission planning, all of it developed during the B-29 campaign, became standard practice for every heavy bomber that followed. The human cost of the B-29 campaign against Japan was severe, though not as catastrophic as earlier bombing campaigns in Europe. The 8th Air Force in Europe lost over 26,000 dead. The B-29 force in the Pacific lost approximately 576 aircraft to all causes, with roughly 5,800 crew members killed or missing. The 315th Wing's losses were proportionally lighter: 3 aircraft, 30 crew members. Their missions were dangerous but not suicidal. Those 30 men deserve to be remembered. Aviation radioman 2nd Class Frank Murphy shot down over Shimotsu on July 20, 1945. He was 20 years old, from Pittsburgh. Sergeant Harold Greenwood, flight engineer on an aircraft that suffered engine failure during takeoff and crashed on Guam, 23 years old, from Des Moines. Lieutenant Robert Walsh, radar operator killed by flak during the final mission on August 14, 24 years old, from Baltimore. The war ended the next day. Walsh was one of the last American combat casualties of World War II. Their deaths demonstrated the fundamental truth about technological warfare. Even when the technology works perfectly, people still die. Eagle radar couldn't protect crews from flak or mechanical failure or the random violence of combat. It could only give them better tools to do an impossible job. And for most of them, most of the time, those tools were enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.